Jerome Mayhew.
Mr Deputy Speaker, when we're discussing whether or not we should have this national insurance contribution rise, we ought to look at what we're intending to use that money for, because this is, after all, as the Honourable Member for Gloucester mentioned, a hypothecated tax. There are two crucial elements of improvements to our society that the government is looking to address. One is the COVID backlog, which currently has waiting times of more than 6 million people waiting, of which 310,000 are waiting for more than 1 year. And adult social care, where there's a desire widely held by many of our constituents right across this House, I'm sure, to cap care costs. Reforms that would assist 150,000 people to help with their care costs at the time of greatest need. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe there's a degree of consensus that these are good proposals that need to happen. We need to spend this money. So the real question isn't whether we spend the money, it's how do we pay for it. And I will give way.
Who benefit from the cap on care costs, which are disproportionately people in more expensive homes. But where is the help in that funding for the 1.5 million people that Age Concern assess should be entitled to social care but have now been excluded from the provisions?
Intervention. The Honourable Member made a number of interventions already to the Minister, who gave full responses to those interventions. So the question that I take is how are you going to pay for it? And there seems to be only three answers to that. You can take that money from other priorities in government, you can borrow it, or you can increase taxation. In the debate so far, I've heard no suggestions of other areas of government spending that should be reduced. And typically, the opposition moved to defence spending as a simple way of extracting money from other commitments. But I will just in a second. But in today's environment, defence spending is very unlikely to be an area of future reductions. In fact, it's going to be, I submit, the opposite. I will give way.
Honourable members, very kindly, I'm grateful for him giving way, but he was seeking suggestions there, and I just wondered what he thought about the £8.7 billion worth of PPE equipment that's been incinerated and gone up in flames. Surely nobody in their right minds can suggest that's a good use of public money. Is it not possible to claw back some of the costs of that from the supplies, if indeed the supplies were defective?
Grateful for the Honourable Member's intervention. What I suggest is a very good use of public money is the emergency funding of PPE when we most desperately needed it in a national lockdown. And it was inevitable that there'd be a trade-off between speed, which every member of this House was cheering the government on at the time, and the ability to maximise the effectiveness of every single contract. So I hope the government makes no apology for the speed at which it dealt with that crisis, and they should be commended for it. Another suggestion has been made that we should crack down on fraud, and the Right Honourable Member for Leeds West referenced a £4.7 billion headline in COVID-related fraud, but she failed to give credit for the actions that the government have taken to address that. The first one being the Taxpayer Protection Task Force, which has recruited 1,265 staff that have, with the work done by the Insolvency Service and Company House, linking powers to link company directors directly to their bounce-back loans, which has been used, by the way, on 61,758 companies and attaching £2.1 billion of loans. The combination of those two factors means that the new estimate, which the Right Honourable Member did not find time to refer to, is not £4.7 billion but £3.3 billion, reducing estimated fraud of contracts down to 7.5% of contracts, which compares, at least within spitting distance, of the average for government programmes of, I'm sorry to say, as much as 5%. But even if... I will give way.
Member makes a very valid point about the need to increase spending to pay for social care and raises the different ways of doing that. I was just wondering whether he agrees with me that if you're going to increase spending on a sustainable basis, you need a sustainable source of money to do that. And a one-off windfall tax, which just occurs one year, cannot fund long-term commitments. That cutting back on fraud in one particular year cannot fund long-term commitments.
The honourable member for Cambridge South is absolutely right, because even if you recovered all of that money, all 3.3 billion, that would be for a single year only. And it's the great mistake that the opposition has made, is they're conflating single windfall taxes, was another example, which is a single tax compared to ongoing revenue needs. So the next option is to borrow the money. And of course, this is the easy response. And really, that is the Labour position, although they couldn't quite bring themselves to admit it from the dispatch box. But this, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not free money, because we have to service that debt and eventually we have to repay it. So it's our children and our grandchildren who we are passing the responsibility for tax cuts now, which is essentially what the Labour Party is arguing for. And our servicing of debt already costs, Madam Deputy Speaker, £64 billion estimated last year. Now, that's £955 for every single member of the population. And because of inflation, which is a global phenomenon, because of the likely rise of interest rates, that is forecast to rise to £75 billion for this financial year. So when the Right Honourable Member for Leeds West says the government has a policy of buy now, pay later, what could be a better description of Labour's response to this very prescient need that we want to improve social care? We need to have a COVID fight back. We've got to pay for it. So there is an option. We can borrow. But as I've said before, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's our children and our grandchildren who will be paying that price. And so I believe the government is quite right to balance the increased social spending that we want to achieve with the tax necessary to pay for it. And if you look at the total measures that the government brought in, you will see that they were deeply progressive and that the Treasury analysis shows that it was net positive for 80% of households, whereas Labour's plan to remove the national insurance contribution would actually help the top 10% the most by more than £1,000. Surely that's not their policy. So no Conservative government wants to raise tax, but it is our duty, before cheap popularity, to be responsible custodians of national finances. But I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a lesson that Labour has never learned.
Yes, I'm